Hi guys, it is Tamara. Thank you so much for coming back to my channel. Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about intergenerational trauma and the correlation between intergenerational trauma and emotionally detached parents. You know, a lot of the reasons why some parents are emotionally detached is because they have unresolved challenges in their past. But I think what we fail to realize most of the time is that those unresolved challenges tends to be intergenerational trauma. You know, sometimes it's unresolved mental illness, sometimes it's unresolved anger, resentment, jealousy within the family. Sometimes it's really bad learned behavior, but other times it's just the simple fact that there's trauma that hasn't been tapped into. So I'm going to highlight in today's video what that's all about. Thank you so much for coming back to my channel. For all of you who are subscribed and participating, thank you so much. And for those who are new, I encourage you to hit that subscribe button so you can stick around with us and become a part of our growing community. And in case you don't know who I am, let me go ahead and briefly introduce myself. My name is Tamara, and I'm an internationally and board certified trauma therapist, but I'm also licensed in mental health within my own private practice. And I see children, teens, families, and adults dealing with trauma. I've talked a lot about emotionally detached parents over the past week or two, and a lot of you have responded really well. You responded really well to some of the things that I was saying, some of the topics that I zoned in on, some of the points that were made, and I think it became apparent to me that this is a topic that most of you on my channel probably can relate to. So I think it's important that I highlight intergenerational trauma as being a part of emotionally detached parents as well. Now, let me just highlight a couple of things before we jump into this video. So let's talk about what's known as risk and protective factors. Okay, so let's start with risk factors. Here's a definition of risk factors, right over here. Risk factors, if I put it in a practical sense, it's basically anything that has been done to you or that you've experienced over your childhood development and adolescent development as well, has had a negative impact on you. So a risk factor, for example, could be something like, having both parents who were 18 when they had you, or having one parent who's a substance abuser and the other one is a single parent. Being born with medical conditions that are hard to manage, that kept you in the hospital a lot, that really broke the financial stability of the family, that led to homelessness. Those are all risk factors. Another really important risk factor would be something like truancy as a child, right? Having a parent or you even yourself not going to school when you should have been and really getting far behind in terms of developmental milestones and intellect and education. So those are all risk factors. They make life a little bit more difficult for us to manage. Now, protective factors are things, that basically, they kind of provide that buffer between you and life, it's that factor that really kind of holds you up and stabilizes you as you go through life. Now, a protective factor would be something like, going to college, having a two-parent household, having middle-class income, right? Having access to good job. That I would even go so far as to say that, sometimes race itself can be a protective factor, right? If you're Caucasian and you're from an upper-class neighborhood, that's a protective factor in and of itself, right? If you're of color and you're from a quote-unquote ghetto or a bad location, then, that's a risk factor, your geographical location. So, protective factors, again, they buffer you with life. Now, let's say, you're dealing with a parent who's emotionally detached and unavailable to you. The first thing that you want to do is kind of look at that parent's risk factors. If you're, old enough to do so, kind of do an inventory over their life and look for those risk factors because they impact the ways in which that parent relates to you, whether you're a child, a teen, or an adult, Risk factors for you as well causes you to relate to your parent in a certain way. So let's say you are trying to live life in a lower class neighborhood. You have a substance abusing mother. Your father watches porn all the time and he gets drunk. He beats his girlfriend in front of you. That's another risk factor, domestic violence and trauma. And so now you're entrenched in trauma, and you're really trying to push forward with a life that's really difficult. And it almost makes you want to die, right? It almost can push you to suicidal thoughts. You don't want to be here anymore, right? Because everything looks so grim. Those are all risk factors, right? you want to look at those and say, okay, is this impacting the way that I respond to my parent as well? You know, so these are things that you want to look at in your own life. Now, so those are risk and protective factors. Okay. Another thing that I want to mention is your parents' history of trauma. That's another thing that can cause an emotionally unavailable parent. They just close off, they put up the defensive wall, they don't know how else to deal with their unresolved trauma. So what do? They just react, they respond. But in doing so, right, to children who are unsuspecting, to children who are adults, or I should say adult children who need a certain level of support, that's not going to work. It's not going to work at all, you know? So these are things to kind of look at, all right? So let's go ahead and narrow this down to intergenerational trauma. So what happens? Well, intergenerational trauma, guys, it's basically trauma that has not been resolved. It started in the back, in your history, somewhere way back when, right? It started there. It never got dealt with. And so patterns of behaviors and thoughts and emotions and attitudes and viewpoints and religious beliefs and family beliefs and all of that got passed down to you. And so now here you are within that generational lineage really suffering. Okay. So let me just highlight some of the things that your detached and emotionally unavailable parent is likely to do. I think it's important for me to highlight that, you know, this parent may or may not be impacted by intergenerational trauma. So if you have an emotionally unavailable parent, it doesn't always mean, you know, that this parent has a history of trauma, but it's a likely, you know, it's a likelihood. There's a possibility there. All right. So the first thing that gets passed down from intergenerational trauma impacts your parent and causes them to act a certain way towards you is kind of like this repeated pattern of attitudes, behaviors, and world perspectives. Now, what I mean by that is, you know, you had somebody in your family that had a certain ideology. They have a certain political belief about, you know, relationships and raising children and, you know, where you should live and where you shouldn't live and who you should talk to, who you should date, who you should be married to, right? Somebody that has all of those views can pass it down to your parent, which it can become a burden to your parent. And it can also cause such a rift between your parent and their parent or that person in your family that your parent becomes depressed, isolated, withdrawn, discouraged, right? And they just give up. Now they begin to try to heal themselves by either taking on those same beliefs and saying, you know what, I think he or she was right. Or, right, they may try to over-identify with that person, or they can take on that pain and begin to self-medicate with drugs, alcohol, sex, whatever else that they can think of. Okay, so it's this repeated pattern of thoughts, behaviors, attitudes, and worldviews that can impact your parent, that causes them to act in a dysfunctional fashion, that in turn gets spread onto you. And so now you become the target, whether that's the emotional or psychological target. Maybe you're sexually abused. Maybe there's emotional incest. I talk a lot about that right up here in this video if you want to go check it out. And, you know, in some ways that parent can try to mold you to think in that very same way. So it's like this repeated pattern, this cycle of unhealthy thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and worldviews. Okay, so that's one way to look at this. The next way that I want you to kind of look at this, guys, is that, you know, when you're talking about intergenerational trauma, you know, that particular parent doesn't always understand boundaries. If there's been how can I put this, a disruption of appropriate boundaries throughout that parent's, you know, development, then they're going to take on some attitudes and some behaviors that's not going to be healthy, and it's going to get passed down to you. And so let's say, for example, that unhealthy, lack of proper boundaries, I can put it that way, that unhealthy set of proper boundaries, I'll put it that way, can basically turn into a lot of corporal punishment or spanking, which can then escalate into child abuse. Maybe sexual abuse was also normalized in the family, and sexual incest, emotional incest, you know. Maybe there was domestic violence that turned into child abuse as well, and child neglect. Maybe there was what we call permissive parenting, which is right over here. Maybe there was authoritarian parenting, which is right up here. Whatever that lack of boundaries did throughout the generations within your family, it can get passed on to your parent and they begin to treat you in ways that's not healthy. Okay. The next thing that I want you guys to think of is, broken down communication. This is something, guys, that happens in a lot of families that I see for psychotherapy and who also consult with me. It's that broken down pattern of communication. Maybe your mother's mother could not communicate appropriately and it caused a rift between them and their parent-child relationship, right? Maybe your great-great-grandfather could not communicate appropriately and it got passed down onto your parent, who is now beginning to reenact that same thing in their relationship with you. They're not able to parent, they're not able to communicate their love, their goals, their desires, their needs, or nothing to you or anything to you. They're just, they're closed off, they're defensive, you can't talk to them, they can't talk to you. It's just a very bad dynamic. Well, that dynamic, may have started way back and it just got passed down. Okay, so that's another thing. Another thing, guys, would be unresolved emotions. In intergenerational trauma, there's a lot of unresolved emotions from various people within the family. We can go back to slaves, back in slavery times, if we're talking about people of color. There's unresolved emotions about being a slave, owning a slave, being very depressed at those times, not having opportunities, feeling held down, not being able to connect with other people that maybe we wanted to connect with, because the whole social theory was stay away from people of color, whatever the case. And even if we're not talking about race, guys, or racial trauma or racial intergenerational trauma, we can narrow this down to family trauma, right? Having a great-great-grandparent who just could not openly communicate with her family about the rape or the sexual molestation that happened for generations can, have all of these emotions that get passed down to your parent that then gets passed down to you, and it causes that emotional detachment within your relationship with your parent. And a lot of families, it's really hard for communication to be healthy and smooth, and so that triggers a lot of unresolved emotions, and those unresolved emotions really can cause a bad connection between you and your parent. Sometimes that parent, because they don't know how to communicate, they detach completely and they withdraw. And so because of that, they become emotionally detached with you, and it creates even more complex relationship dynamics between the two of you. So very, very sad how that goes in some families. The next thing would be displacement of emotions. Displacement is a defense mechanism. It's actually a defense mechanism that was developed by Sigmund Freud. Here's his definition of displacement. It's basically this: I have emotions about this, but I'm going to take them and put them over here. And a lot of times there are parents, especially in lower income families, lower class families, or families who are struggling with poverty and opportunities to get better employment. They're already stressed and burdened as it is because of their living condition and lack of resources. And then on top of that, we're dealing with a lineage of trauma over the lifespan, and it's impacted that parent. Now that parent is having trouble with you as the child, or they're detached and they can't communicate. Well, what they do is they take emotions from all of those other issues I just mentioned and they place them onto you. And then there you are as the innocent child, adolescent, or adult child trying to figure out why your parent is treating you a certain way. And that's because they've displaced their emotions that have not been worked out and straightened out onto you. All right. So displacement of emotions. The next thing would be something that I talk about a lot on this channel when I'm talking about intergenerational trauma, and that is known as a content mindset. A content mindset basically says this: I don't think there's any way for me to improve. So I think what I'm going to do in this situation is just get comfortable with where I'm at. I'm going to get comfortable with this abuse. I'm going to get comfortable with that mindset. I'm going to get comfortable with being quiet, not openly communicating. I'm going to be quiet with, just all the pain and the sorrow that I feel, and I'm going to be content. I'm not going to allow anything to derail me. I'm going to just sit right here in all my trauma, and I'm going to be okay. Those particular parents end up becoming a problem for their child, their teen, or their adult child. Why? Because they become content in their parenting, which is permissive parenting. They become content in their neighborhoods, and they don't want to move even though they need to. They become content with their goals. They don't set new ones. They become content in terms of school, right? Going to school or with forcing their kids to go to school. They become content with problems. They don't try to work them out or better themselves. They just get okay with it. And they get content with also work and employment. They don't try to better themselves. All of these things, guys, can be seen as risk factors, okay? And these particular risk factors can impact how that parent communicates with you. That's most likely why they are detached and emotionally unavailable. They have a lot of stuff going on in here, and you can't tap into that just by showing that you're angry as the adult child, by refusing to talk to the parent as an adult child, by being angry and walking away and throwing up your hands and saying, you know what, I'm done with this relationship. If it's healthy, by all means do it. Check out this video right here that I did on toxic families. I talked to you all about walking away and when. But I think in this video, I'm just referring to, you know, a child who's dealing with an adult child who's dealing with a detached or emotionally unavailable parent, how you really need to focus on not trying to change that parent, because they're not going to change. They've got a whole foundation of risk factors that's really keeping them in a place where they can't change. So, you know, this is a really difficult topic, guys. And, you know, I have to be honest with you and say that my field has not really focused a lot on this. And my specialization, which is trauma, we have not focused a lot on intergenerational trauma either. So it's a minefield, you know, of ruts, if you ask me, for clients who come into therapy, because it's like you step over here, but there's no answer. You step over there, there's no answer there. Well, okay, I think I'm gonna climb this mountain, there's no answer there. And so it can really make you feel discouraged. It can make you feel, you know, really trapped. But I want to encourage you that I think knowledge is power. So the more you learn about this topic, the stronger you're going to be in terms of managing your parent. Thank you so much for being with me today, guys, in this video. I encourage you to give it a thumbs up and go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you want to stick around with us. I will see you in the next video, which will likely be on Sunday. We're going to continue this conversation. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.